Well, it's a pleasure to welcome back Warwick Powell, a regular guest on BRI Dialogues, and what a timing. Anush is sitting in Durham, I'm sitting in London. From a proximity point of view, Warwick, you're much closer to Beijing, and very soon Donald Trump will make a visit to, um, you know, meet with President Xi. Now, he's going to take the beast, the Cadillac, as it's known. And since he's very much, talking about the cards, what sort of a deck of cards is Donald Trump taking to Beijing? And what sort of cards does he hold in this visit, Warwick?
Well, it's great to be with both of you, Anush and Ali. The deck of cards that President Trump takes, so to speak, I dare say, are made in Beijing, and uh, and I mean that both metaphorically, but of course also in a literal sense, because by and large, most of the manufacturers for these kinds of things have been in China now for the best part of 30 years, and perhaps that is one of the reasons for the anxieties that have animated President Trump and the American body politic now for a little bit more than 10 years. And so I think this trip to Beijing is at a difficult time for the United States, but it's also at a difficult time for the bilateral relationship. And it's at a difficult time for the world at large because the world at large is a world that is at war, and it is one that is experiencing the immediate consequences of war for those who are in the crossfires of the warfare itself, and for those who aren't, it's very hard to not be affected in one way or another as a result of the consequences, either because you have friends and family who are intimately connected to the wars that are happening, or of course we have the economic shockwaves that are working their way across the globe. I think one of the challenges that President Trump faces as he arrives in Beijing in a couple of days' time from this particular moment is that the agenda is actually quite unclear. What on earth is it that the United States and China are going to try to talk about in a meaningful way? I think there is clearly some legacy issues as a result of the trade war last year, which in a sense has been in something of a hiatus since September or thereabouts when Presidents Trump and Xi met in Busan in Korea and agreed on some measures which calmed things down and stabilized the show. But those issues, of course, or the hiatus that was agreed, did not resolve the issues. And I think the issues will continue to percolate. And so I would expect that at a minimum, the questions around trade are going to come up again. I expect that they'll come up in part because the Chinese side has made it quite clear that they've been frustrated by the lack of preparations from those in Washington, and that the Washington team has been clearly incredibly distracted by all sorts of other things going on, which makes it difficult for the kinds of discussions that need to be had at a senior officers level to prepare the groundwork for a leaders summit. So I think trade will be clearly one of those issues where at least there is a long history of dialogue that the sides can build on. I think we also know that President Trump will seek to inveigle Beijing into addressing the problems that have been caused by America's uh, interventions in West Asia by its unprovoked attack on Iran and the aftermath of that as they continue to unfold and propagate across the global system. I don't think he's going to get much joy on that front. The third area where I hope that there will be some progress will be related more to the bilateral economic relationship beyond trade. But I don't expect there to be any grand bargains. The United States clearly needs and has ambitions around rejuvenating its industrial base, but it's really in no position to do that without a collaborative relationship with China. The United States, over 50 years, has progressively seen its industrial base hollow out, and its technological competencies in many of the industries that no longer exist or operate at substantial scale there have literally disappeared. They are no longer world leaders in applied technologies. At the same time, the United States has seen a population quality progressively decline. And we know this because we have reducing levels of numeracy and literacy amongst the American people. And without highly numerate and highly literate people, you actually don't have the kind of workforce that you need for advanced industries. And so what America actually needs is to deepen its engagement with Chinese supply chains and also be more open to the role that Chinese capital and the know-how that comes with it can play in America's own economic stabilization and renewal. I don't think we're going to see a huge amount of joy on that, but perhaps there might be some frameworks that emerge that facilitate discussions. The last thing, and I'll just wrap up on this last point, and I'm not entirely optimistic that there will be substantial outcomes here, but certainly I would hope that there will be some meaningful dialogue around the question of artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Aside from the intense rhetoric around winning the artificial intelligence race and the war and all this sort of stuff, I think it's clear, abundantly clear, that serious people in Beijing and in Washington and also in the different technology hubs that underpin the development of artificial intelligence, both in the United States and in China, that AI, as we understand it to be, can be a very dangerous tool if applied in the wrong ways. And in this particular moment of human history, when tensions and warfare seem to be around us everywhere we turn, the prospects that these wars become AI-driven wars, where machines ultimately make decisions about who or what to target. And in fact, we've seen this happen already in Iran when supposedly dated targeting information was used to target a facility that was actually a school. So we know that AI has already and runs the risk of being a very dangerous tool in these fraught times. And it is imperative that these two leading AI nations find a way to establish the means by which at least they can communicate about these issues, if not to find a framework that can ultimately lead to the responsible development of AI and the governance of AI in a way that doesn't see AI become a tool for war and death. So that's where I think things stand. I don't think President Trump has a lot of cards, so to speak. The relationship is very fraught, and I think it's probably worthwhile having relatively modest expectations about what this particular meeting could deliver.
Warwick, thank you so much for providing that amazing perspective and kind of structure for what is to come. I think, Ali, and I agree with you entirely that I think Trump is going for a photo op rather than anything substantive coming out of this. I keep hearing from Chinese friends and colleagues that they are really concerned about the incompetence of the American side, that they really would like to have serious, strong Americans that they can deal with, and that they're fearful of the weakness of American leadership at this time of transition. And when I say that to Europeans, they say, well, the Chinese want to rule the world in any case, so this is their opportunity. They don't understand that actually balance of power, it doesn't mean to China a zero-sum game. So how do you think President Xi can provide assurances to Trump that it's the Americans themselves who are deepening the grave that as you suggest, was dug 40 odd years ago, and that China is generally there to stabilize the relationship? What signals, what tools can President Xi actually present to Trump to just give their kind of mediocre analysts a better understanding of what China is all about?
Look, I think that that's a very challenging problem because in this current febrile environment where China, in effect, lives rent-free inside the minds of anybody and everybody inside the Beltway, it doesn't really matter what China says or does. It will be portrayed in a particularly negative light, whether it's as a threatening light or China's about to collapse. It won't be interpreted in the correct way. And I think we see this in many other dimensions as well, not just bilateral relationships between China and the United States, but also in the way that the United States has been handling its global diplomacy, if we could even call it that. And that is that the lack of statecraft that is evident now amongst the American political leadership means that it misreads signals all the time. And people have commented often that the United States interprets inaction as a sign of weakness or a reluctance to dive in from the other side as a sign of weakness, when in fact what the other side is usually signaling is a willingness to engage in meaningful dialogue, to find something that could work for everybody involved. It is very easy to respond, in like kind as the United States, provokes others around the world. But I think many around the world understand that that kind of a response would catalyze something that could be much worse for everybody involved. And so the reluctance to, in a sense, follow the Americans down this spiral is a responsible thing, but I'm not sure the Americans necessarily read those signals in the correct way. This issue of competence, I think, is of grave concern. And it's one that has, I think, the seeds really from the time when the Soviet Union was disbanded and the emergence of an American political culture which framed that episode in modern history as one of American conquest rather than as one of a negotiated resolution to the structural foundations of post-war bilateral conflict. And to recognize that, in fact, at that time, the Soviet Union um, uh, disbanded, not because the Americans won in some sort of simplistic or cheap, way, but because that Gorbachev, right or wrong, and I tend to be probably one of those who are less sympathetic to what Gorbachev ultimately did, but nonetheless, I remember at the time, perestroika and glasnost were uh, initiatives pursued with a view to creating a new breath of fresh air for the Soviet Union. But ultimately, it led to the collapse of the state and the collapse of the economy. The embrace of neoliberal shock therapy, for example, ultimately um, did the economic and social fabric of what was the Soviet Union and subsequently the various republics no good whatsoever. And the evidence of that was um, uh, reduced longevity, increases in social dysfunctional indicators, suicide, violence, drugs, and of course alcoholism. Right. So, um, but the misreading of that moment by the American political class, portraying it really as a win, and of course we all know of Francis Fukuyama's most unhelpful book because it fed this sense of hubris that ultimately saw the watering down of American statecraft and capability. So it stems from then. Then you've got 30 years of unipolar dominance where you really didn't need much statecraft at all. You literally saw the world as your own oyster, and you would bully your way around the world in the pursuit of whatever objectives that you had. And we have clear evidence of that from research work published by Duffy Toft and Cushy, which in their book, Dying by the Sword, which was a book about the militarization of American foreign policy. And it goes through the evidence of American military interventions, which shows that, in fact, the number of military interventions per year on average increased in the years after the end of the Cold War compared to the years before the Cold War. So in an era when the Americans were supposedly at their most secure and dominant, they actually went ahead and initiated far more military interventions around the world. So there is a real problem with competence now, because competence takes generations to build. And when you hollow out generations and strip institutions of memory and of people with connections and a deft understanding of the other side and the complexities of the world, then it's no surprise that you end up with people like Pete Hegseth running the show. And as you strip the place of statecraft, you also strip it of other more fundamental competencies, I would suggest, including things like empathy. Because without empathy for those that you are engaging with at an international level, it is actually impossible to, well, maybe not always meet somebody halfway, but to at least meet them somewhere along the pathway, as opposed to just trying to impose your will. So competency is a big worry all around.
I'm thinking about, sorry, the word statecraft, and I remember a piece I wrote recently, and I said that the State Department has turned into a real estate department. You know, it's all about land and developments and the positions, but the statecraft as well, economic statecraft has met with, economic straightcraft, which is the Strait of Hormuz. Now, in that context, as Anush was saying, there is this, I would say, twilight zone for Europe. On one side, they know that their future is in Eurasia. On one side, their, energy security is caught between shipping LNG across the Atlantic with high emissions and a transformation into renewables. China, again, there has the dominance, Warwick. So how do you see this outplaying and the outcome of this in terms of this systemic shock at the energy markets? And what will Brussels, Berlin, London, and Paris make of this trip? You know, if President Trump is going for a Beijing bargain, what's in it for them in this Rubik cube?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the capability or the competency of those in Brussels is seriously under question and has been for quite some time. The idea that they've allowed the transatlantic ally to dominate their own decision making about what their interests are and how the interests of Western Europe can be best prosecuted is beyond me. And I'm sure it's beyond many citizens of the member states of the European Union. The challenges, I think, for Europe are multi-layered and multifold. Clearly, the economic structure or the economic setup of Western European economies is not delivering on the aspirations of many Europeans today. And that's seeing dislocations in all sorts of industries, deindustrialization of Germany, for example. But not only Germany, there are many other kinds of industrial dislocation experiences now happening across Western Europe and, of course, also into the UK, where there are significant political and public backlashes to the current state of affairs. So there is, I think, a set of contradictions, if you will, between the policy parameters and priorities of those who sit in the decision-making power positions of member states and the population at large. I also think that there are contradictions between the aspirations of leaders at a national level and the aspirations, the political aspirations of those who occupy the seats of power in Brussels. So we've got nation states in Brussels also engaged in an ongoing process of loggerheads. So we've got a few layers of contradictions, if you will, already in Western Europe. On top of that, clearly the global structural change has left Western Europe writ large a little bit flat-footed. That's to put it quite mildly. The energy transitions that are happening all around the world, or at least the radical restructuring of global energy flows, really puts the challenge on European capitals to find a pathway to a more viable, more economically sustainable, but also a more nationally sovereign energetic platform than the one that they've currently been on. Whether it's exposure to gas from Russia or exposure to even more expensive gas from across the Atlantic, neither of these positions really sits particularly well with people in Western Europe, particularly today compared to, say, 6 years ago when people weren't so anxious about buying oil and gas from Russia, whereas they are today. I think the third dimension of all of this is that Europe writ large is confronting a need to rethink what it is again. Right, so this is me speaking from a long way away, right? So take this set of observations for what they are, but it seems to me that the European project has been a fraught project from day one for lots of different reasons, and the current episodes of challenges, such as its relationships with Russia and also its relationships with Asia and China in particular, are just examples of a political project that has never really developed any genuine sense of strategic coherence. You can't have a project, which is what the idea of Europe is, without actually, cornerstone purpose and clarity of understanding about how you interact with other major parts of the world. So the European project was largely a colonial project after the Second World War, and it was pursued to balance off Washington to some extent in the post-war environment, but also to keep the colonies in and to know their place. So you'll notice that the European project, and this has been covered in a number of academic works and also in a rather provocatively titled book called Euro-Whiteness, this idea that the European project was largely a racial project centered around Western Europe. Africa had its place, but it was a subordinate place. And eventually, the Slavic people of the East also were provided a space within the wider European project, but certainly not in the driver's seat. And so we have a European project that's incredibly narrowly conceived, and yet it needs to have a proper relationship with its largest land neighbor and economic neighbor, which of course is Russia, and it needs to have a proper relationship with Asia, with what it would have seen as the Orient, and until it can find a way to acknowledging that these two parts of the world that share a continent, by the way, with the Western European states, are significant civilizational states, then I think Western Europe's always going to struggle to find a meaningful seat at the table as a coherent project. So that's my take from a long way away.
Very astute indeed, Warwick. I want to sidestep a bit from what Ali was raising, but on a similar theme. When the dust eventually settles on the crisis in Strait of Hormuz, we'll be able to see much more clearly the disparity between a fossil fuel driven economy, as Trump is following, and the Chinese renewable driven economy that we are seeing. But people talk about it in very abstract terms, Warwick, about, China has got all the renewable cars in its hands, and Trump talking about drill, baby, drill, and that, the world is to be found in fracking. We will supply you whatever you need, and so on. But there is much less focus, little understanding of the structural cleavages which have opened through the Strait of Hormuz, literally, um, and that there is going to be massive imbalances that will follow, even if the oil price drops back to say $45 a barrel. I can't think of anybody better placed than you, Warwick, to put structure and concept behind what is likely to happen after this crisis is eventually over in terms of continuing over-reliance on fossil fuels from one superpower to another, having made the transition in a very amazingly brave way to the world of our unknown, which is now very clear the future.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I'll see how I go. I should also mention in that discussion about Western Europe that Iran, of course, is a civilizational state on the continent of Eurasia as well. And it's interesting that the challenges that the Western European project, if you will, have been having in relation to Eurasia writ large is actually with the three largest civilizational states on the entire continent. And interestingly, it's these three civilizational states that have figured out that they're neighbors, but and they need to be able to get on with each other and find ways in which they can do that, notwithstanding all of the pressures that exist, particularly in relation to the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia since 2014, and of course the sanctions and other punitive measures that have been dished out to Iran since 1979. So, um, so that sort of, in a sense, is a segue, if you will. The issue of um, the global energy structure um, needs to be seen in a longue durée sense. So this is the idea of that part of the way that history works is that there are things that take centuries to unfold. And this question of energy is one of those where, for about 200 years or so, Western societies in particular have been able to harness and exploit and put to useful work the energetic reserves that have been accumulated over many millions of years that we find in the earth, whether it's through coal or, of course, oil and gas. And in doing so, Western societies in particular have been able to create a vast reservoir of surplus energy above and beyond their immediate daily reproductive needs that they could channel into all sorts of other things: the building of institutions, the expansion of infrastructure and fixed capital, which is ultimately embodied energy, the creation of, great cultures, is part and parcel of the possibilities when you have access to a large amount of surplus energy. And Western societies have been able to do that. Of course, as they've done that, they've also worked their way on the back of their original maritime dominance to increasingly dominate other parts of the world and impose their economic and political will on what became known as the Third World. But prior to that, I think we'd simply call them the victims of imperialism. So that's the sort of long context. People also often talk about the current moment as one of being in the middle of an energy transition. I think we need to be a little bit cautious about thinking of it necessarily in black and white transitional terms, in that it probably isn't quite a case that we'll see one kind of dominant fuel source disappear fully, not for a long time anyway, to somehow get replaced by another. What human societies have tended to do is function energetically in additive terms. So we just keep adding on the new capabilities that we have developed on top of older systems. And it takes a long time for those older systems to reduce in terms of their overall scale and the proportionate contributions that they make to the energy systems that we have as human societies around the world. But be that as it may, I think we are reaching a point where, at the very least, the energetic return on energy invested of hydrocarbons in many parts of the world, not in all parts of the world, but in many parts of the world, is reaching a turning point where, or has already reached a turning point where, even though there is still plentiful resource in the ground, it actually costs us more and more energy to get that resource out. And when that moment arrived, we started to see how societies over time became incredibly stressed because the surpluses simply weren't there to resource the kinds of things that surpluses used to, the superstructures that would be built on top of massive energy surpluses. And so we are now at a moment where the United States is embarking on a kind of thermodynamic imperialism because its own energetic resources, albeit plentiful in the ground, is nonetheless increasingly expensive to access. So this is this shale revolution situation. And it's also come to a view that it doesn't want its rivals, as it sees them, to have access to plentiful energetic resources as well. And so it's embarking on a raft of energy imperialism initiatives, whether it's Venezuela or Iran or what have you. But in some ways, my own sense is that it's a bit late. It's understandable why it's happening now, but I think it's a bit late. And I think it's understandable, firstly, because the pressure is on. It is quite clear that the unipolar moment is over, and there is a sort of a recovery logic, if you will, for the United States to seek to forestall the problems that it's experiencing, to try to contain those that it sees as rivals, and ultimately find a way in which it can maintain a certain level of domination wherever it can, to the extent that it can. There's been some very interesting recent work by somebody who we all know, Nel Benio, who has been um, researching the archives of the American military-industrial complex and the thinking that was being developed around 30 years ago. And she's actually talked a bit about the documentation from that time, which identified, the shale revolution as a pivotal moment for the United States because it gave it a level of political freedom that perhaps it didn't have when it was entirely dependent upon oil from the Middle East. But at the same time, they recognized that this shale revolution won't last forever. And I guess one of the concerns of those sitting in positions of power is that it's reached a point where the shale revolution is actually petering out. And when they're looking across the Pacific at a place like China, which is powering ahead and becoming what many call an electrified state, then there are tremendous concerns from the establishment in the United States that that the window is closing fast, and perhaps that also explains the anxieties and the hurry now that exists to try to assert some control over the circuits of energy flow. The reason why I say I think it's a bit late is because China, in large part, has overcome the exposure to the risks associated with oil from the Middle East. It's not that it's not affected, but it's not going to cripple the Chinese national economy in the way that perhaps it would have had it stopped flowing 20 or so years ago. And that's happened because the Chinese government understood that they were exposed, that the national economy was exposed to the risks of dependency on oil energy from one part of the world, and which could be interceded through the Straits of Malacca, actually, was the main concern. So back in 2003, then President Hu Jintao talked about the Malacca dilemma. And from that time onwards, a concerted effort was made by China to restructure the way that it fueled its economy. And it did that by diversifying sources of hydrocarbons. So it didn't fundamentally change technology, it just found alternative supply sources. But at the same time, it embarked on an intense effort to become more energetically sovereign, whether it was through hydrocarbons, nuclear, and as things panned out, through the developments and eventually sort of global leadership in renewable or clean energies and storage. So that's where China's at today, to a point where its economy is exposed at about 15% of its overall energy needs to oil, and about 7% of that 15%, so not quite half, maybe 6.5, 7%, is oil that comes from the Middle East. So in the scheme of things, we're talking about an economic system that has about a 6-7% exposure to Middle Eastern oil disruptions. The last thing China, of course, did was build up massive reserves that would give it time to cope with the kinds of disruptions that we had. Now, I'll try to summarize a couple of other thoughts quite quickly to try to complete a story, if you will, around structure. So as the shortages become more apparent, consequent to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the economic effects throughout the supply chain networks of the world will start to play out. And they'll play out in different ways depending on which countries and which industries we're talking about. So I developed, I guess, a bit of a framework or a model that at least hopes to help guide a way of thinking about how national economies might adapt. We obviously have economies that are incredibly fossil fuel dependent and mature. The United States is one of those, incidentally. But it's not the only one, but it's one of those. And those kinds of economies have a significant amount of risk exposure to disruptions caused by shortages. We see that in the United States, not because the US has shortages per se, but because of its effects through the pricing system. We also have national economies that are much less dependent on fossil fuels, but nonetheless are energetically mature economies. And I'm thinking, of course, of a place like China. It still has effects, but it has the capabilities to reasonably quickly make those adjustments and to replace old energetic systems with newer ones. Nothing smooth, by the way, but nonetheless, it can be done. Then you've got national economic systems which are relatively undeveloped, but which are at the same time quite exposed to the oil shock. And these are economies that are heavily dependent on things like diesel, for example, for electricity generation. The irony is that whilst they are the most exposed, they also have limited legacy infrastructure that would hold them back to adopting clean energy systems. What does hold them back, of course, is finance. And then you've got economies that are actually relatively undeveloped from an energy systems point of view, generally speaking, with limited diesel, limited renewable energy systems. And those economies, again, short of finance capital, have very little legacy infrastructure impediments to also make the adjustments. And so I think we can start to map a world where we have these sort of four ideal types, if you will, and we can then begin to understand those which are, theoretically speaking, at least better positioned to adapt than those that aren't. And then we can explore what the impediments are to them making those adaptations. And of course, one of those is finance. But there's certainly no reason why, given the availability of low-cost clean energy systems, that many of these nation states cannot move relatively quickly to implementing these sorts of solutions, whether it's microgrids, and the beauty of microgrids is that you're not building big, expensive grids. These are, again, fast to roll out. We're talking 6 months, 12 months, as opposed to 3-4 years. And these are the sorts of things that I think have a very good chance of building up ahead of steam. A paradox, of course, but nonetheless, it's the silver lining out of this present set of dark clouds.
Warwick, that is a very nice segue to my question, which has been percolating in my head in anticipation of our talk today. I have been rather vocal, and I said, and I'd love to have your thoughts because this is your expertise on digital finance, blockchain, and energy. There is a massive buildup of private capital and investment and investment and investment in the likes of OpenAI and American AI engine. And I am rather watching two developments. One was the Lehman moment. So from a Lehman moment to an Altman moment, as a Sam Altman, right? And the other one is Tyrannus, if you remember Elizabeth Holmes, who set up that company with, and there was no shortage of luminaries, from James Mattis to George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, and then it went bust. Are we, or should we be as well concerned about a systemic risk, whether through the massive leverage of capital and very little to show from some of these AI models in the States, or through a faux pas with someone like OpenAI? And what would that then do to this last frontier of competition between United States, where it's hyperscaling, and China's model, which is fusion and application of AI?
Yeah. I'll tell you a little funny story first about the Lehman moment. I was in Sydney in 2008, and I was talking to someone at a bar, and this person proudly showed me their business card. They'd just become the vice president of Lehman Brothers in Australia and Asia, and I was looking over this person's shoulder at the ticker across the bottom of the television screen, announcing the collapse of Lehman Brothers in New York.
Ouch.
And
Ouch.
and I said to the person I was talking to, I said, look, I don't know the structure of Lehman Brothers globally, and so this might not be of any relevance to you whatsoever, but take a look at what's going on the TV screen. And he had a look, turned around, turned back, and took it all in his stride, and actually just said to me, well, at least I became vice president for a day. And so that was the Lehman moment. It's one of those experiences where, it's the, can you remember the moment when? So anyway, look, my own view is that the American AI business model is not viable. And it's not viable in large part because it hasn't resolved how it's going to deal with the electricity question today relative to how China's AI stack is already dealing with it, number one. And number two, it's because its entire model and the way in which it raised the billions of dollars that have gone into it so far was premised on the idea that American AI would have very wide and deep moats around the general models, and that the general models would then support the progression towards artificial general intelligence, which would then enable total dominance. That collapsed when DeepSeek came onto the scene a bit over a year ago, because the model of paid subscription at high price for access to these general intelligence models was literally destroyed when DeepSeek went open source. And DeepSeek isn't the only project that's gone open source. And once that happened, I think the sort of American AI model, and I mean by this the business model, I think became unviable. And it's been trying to find a pathway out ever since. Yes, it's got some enterprise subscriptions, but at the end of the day, I can't see the business model as it stands today, being able to generate sufficient revenues to deliver the kind of returns that you would expect for the investments that were made in them, which means that at some point in time, the balance sheets will need to make their necessary adjustments. And those adjustments, so that people are very clear about this. Adjustments is such a nice word, isn't it? It almost makes it sound soft and gentle. But a balance sheet adjustment is literally an impairment. The price crashes. And when the price crashes, a whole bunch of other things can follow from that, including significant industry overhaul. There could be a lot of debt attached to valuations that will unravel. And it will also have reverberating effects on the downstream contracts that have been signed with data centers, all of whom have, of course, signed contracts with the suppliers of all sorts of things, usually on the back of debt as well. So much of the construction has been financed, and then we've got debt attached to it. And we could well be sitting on a very nasty deck of cards. So I do think that the American AI business model, as it stands today, is on the cusp of an adjustment. And the adjustment will, of course, impair valuations financially, but it will also leave some hardware projects stranded for some time because there won't actually be demand for them. So half-built data centers and those sorts of things, as well as progressive, incomplete upgrades of electricity networks that have been stalled because of a shortage of transformers or a lack of skilled electricians to do connection work or what have you. So I think that there is likely to be some wreckage. One of the interesting things about this is going to be the timing of it. It's one thing to say that the American AI business model is unviable. The question is when does that get reflected in a share value or balance sheet correction? And I think one of the political challenges for the Trump administration at the moment is keeping the bubble going until after the 3rd of November. I would expect there to be an incredible effort made by the administration to provide the market with an extensive amount of comfort that these major companies have got significant contracts with the US government, have protective environments provided to them vis-a-vis Chinese competition, etc., etc. Otherwise, the valuations, I think, really do run a risk of crashing down sooner rather than later. What happens after the 3rd of November, I think, is a totally different matter altogether. The administration will probably care a lot less after that date than they would prior to that date. The other issue, I think, is that there's a different posture or a different attitude about AI and how it is or isn't useful and relevant. And you touched on it when you talked about China's emphasis on applications, right? So once the models went open, then the competition really was about applications, how it gets used, what are the tools that are built using these foundational capabilities, and how do they get used in industry and social governance and education and what have you. And I think, and I'm sort of wanting to be a little bit cautious about excessive sort of civilizational essentialism, but I think that the sort of broad Chinese attitude towards technology and particularly AI is quite different, is often quite different from the attitude that has been brought to the table in terms of the Western attitudes towards AI. And the Chinese attitudes really see AI as a tool that can be put to use by people in the name of doing things for people that people want. And one of the interesting things is the characters that comprise artificial intelligence in Chinese. And the character for intelligence is one that, or two characters, is zheneng. And the two characters together speak to a kind of informed capability, which has a very practical edge. Right, this sense that it's an application, whereas there are other words in Chinese for intelligence that speak to things like wisdom, knowledge through accumulation of experience, which is a very different kind of intelligence. And so even in the way that artificial intelligence was translated into Chinese gives us a hint that a Chinese disposition has been far more around how it can be mobilized for useful purpose rather than somehow replace or emulate human intelligence in those other senses. The other thing that I think we and that there's a philosophical opportunity, if you will, between the West and the East, is that Western AI has tended to not grasp, I think, some of the more basic kinds of intelligences that humans have around things like our intuitions and our more primordial relationship with the world, I guess, is what I'm thinking. And this is the idea that you also find in the Chinese Tao, this idea that if you can get aligned with the flow of how the world works, things are really smooth. And that sense of being in the flow is an intuitive, primordial experience. And technology can be related to like that. And if we relate to technology and AI a little bit more like that, rather than thinking that it can become an emulation of humans and that in fact humans can behave like gods to create emulations of ourselves, then we might be able to mobilize artificial intelligence in ways that are useful, as opposed to ways in which, as we touched on earlier, could become incredibly risky for, not just humans, but risky for life on Earth.
Yeah, Warwick, that's brilliant. As you were speaking, the word alienation was bobbing around my head in terms of this relation or interaction with something like artificial intelligence. Your incredible book, Warwick, Thermoeconomics in a Time of Monsters, that I've really enjoyed reading, I recommend it to all of our viewers, is so rich and is kind of four-dimensional. You've already talked about energy as value in the discussions we've had. You've touched on AI as well, and you've also looked at China, albeit not in the very direct way that you do in the book. I have two very quick questions for you. On China, when you speak about, whether this is global capitalism reaching a point of kind of no return, that it's gone from hegemon to hegemon to hegemon to hegemon, and you imply that now we are at China. So I want you to just maybe unpack that a little bit about, what does the state capitalist model of China mean to this maturity, what Lenin called the final stage of capitalism way back when. And the other one relates to artificial intelligence that we touched upon. And you've again talked about it in terms of sociocultural, socioeconomic, and governance. But the other concern that in fact, there's this documentary coming out on Friday about this, about the aspect of control that AI has, that far from being a liberator, it has two rather negative dimensions from a socioeconomic point of view. One is that it's now demolishing entry-level jobs, certainly in mature capitalist countries. And the other one is the degree of control that is giving unaccountable states. And those states don't have to be authoritarian. We can see it in the United States as much as elsewhere in mature democracies as well. Could you reflect on those two issues? The end of, capitalism as it's gone over the last 250 years, and also this aspect of AI that seems to be an ongoing, if not a growing concern.
I'll deal with them in reverse order, actually. I'll deal with the AI stuff a little bit quicker, and hopefully then I can just reflect a little bit more on the sort of historical question. The AI issues around control, I think, are related to the ways in which human beings need to rethink their own sense of responsibility. So again, this goes to this idea of whether AI is a tool that people can use and that contributes to the ways in which nature and the world can reveal itself to us as being, as opposed to it being something that ultimately enframes us as beings, and where it becomes embodied inside our own actions, if you will, and we become servants of the technology. So I think that there is a broader issue there, and it's not necessarily a capitalism or a socialism or a communism or whatever question, but it goes a lot more to an ontological question in our broad relationship to technology generally. So there's a little bit of a hint of an answer there. The issue of the evolution of capitalism is, and the book in a sense touches on this in a few ways. So the book sets up an approach which draws some inspiration from Giovanni Arrighi's long 20th century, which of course is a Gramsci and a Marx-inspired historical narrative of the rise and fall of different national capitalisms over the course of 500 years or so, national empires, if you will, from the Dutch all the way eventually through to the British and then to the Americans. And the question, of course, in Arrighi's work is, are we now at the inflection point where the American capitalist empire has reached the end of days? And in fact, he tries to touch on some of that in another book called Adam Smith in Beijing. But and there's been a little bit of a literature spurned off this because that is the obvious question. This sense of transition from one dominant player to the next. But the underlying logic that Arrighi describes is one in which an industrial system grows and expands, and as it expands, it becomes increasingly financialized. And as it becomes increasingly financialized, it offshores its industrial activity. And over time, the new industrial center starts to do the same thing. And it comes back to bite the original industrial power that ultimately ends up with nothing. So you can see how this story is very appealing when we want to look at the rise and fall of the British Empire or the Dutch Empire, and of course now with the heavily financialized American empire. So that's the sort of starting point, if you will. And I guess I try to develop a theoretical approach to understanding these dynamics, which draws from a few different traditions. Arrighi's entire argument is premised on a particular reading of Marx's own formulation of the circuits of capital accumulation, which for those of you who've read Marx will sort of recognize it as M to C, C to P, P to C prime, C prime to M prime, with C being the commodity, M being money, P being production. And the circuit basically involves the transformation of the value form from the money form to a commodity form through production to a new commodity form, and eventually is realized through sale, and it returns to the money form, but with surplus value. So Arrighi's argument is that basically that circuit sees the geography of these elements divvied up. What I try and do is bring a little bit more rigor to that story, and one which grounds that basic story of accumulation and circuits with the laws of thermodynamics, where the substrate of human social and economic activity is grounded on the laws of thermodynamics, principally that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but it changes form, and the second law being that the energetic system is inherently entropic, with a tendency to dissipation, complexity, etc., etc. And what human societies are constantly doing is seeking to bring order to disorder, to impose negentropy on an entropic system, to harness energies, translate that to what we would call useful work, to do things that enable societies to reproduce themselves. And so the tendency then is, if we thought about this through, we'd say, well, Arrighi's story then leads into an American story, which leads into a China story. I tend to think that there is something else going on now. And that is that the American system, and this isn't in the book, by the way, but I've been asked this on a few occasions, that but I tend to think that
You're giving us a preview of the next book, Warwick.
the next book maybe. That the American system's actually big enough, firstly, to not fade in the way that the British system did, number one. But also that there are, in addition to China, there are other relatively large systems. Whether it's the Russian system, whether it's the Brazilian system, even the Indonesian system within my neck of the woods here. So there are other systems, economic, social systems that have sufficient heft to be able to stand on their own in the world. And so rather than this being necessarily a story, a translatio imperii story, as one empire fades to be replaced by the next, I suspect what we are seeing is the end of a chapter of human history which has largely been unipolar to one that is a lot more multipolar. That doesn't mean we've suddenly arrived at a non-unipolar nirvana, by the way. A lot of people, I think, embrace this idea of multipolarity, perhaps, and invest in it a lot of utopian hope that somehow this allows them to, or allows the world to transcend all the things that we've found very distasteful about unipolar systems. But I think nonetheless that this is broadly what's happening, and in this process of evolution, we're going to see quite a bit of violence, I think, from the United States and the political West as it seeks to adjust to these new realities and assert itself where it can and where it must, so as to retain whatever it can retain. But at the same time, it's impossible for this sort of dispersion, distribution of capability, power, and authority to be put back into the box again. And this goes to actually the question of energy, because in the end, when technologies are now available for nations to exist with relative energetic sovereignty, it becomes much harder for others to intervene in the affairs of those states. Lots of other ways that they can, but in terms of those powerful choke points, it becomes very, very much more difficult for those kinds of coercive powers to be exercised. So that's where I tend to suspect. Look, it's an open thing, right? That these systems don't have, obvious pathways. They're not linear, but from my perspective anyway, the probability of the system being a little bit more dispersive is more likely than the system transitioning from one, dominant hegemon to a system with just another dominant hegemon.
Warwick, we're at that point of our dialogues where I always ask, what is your single most important advice to cinephobes and cinephiles? But you've told us that before. So my question to you is that you're transported tonight to Washington, D.C. and to Beijing. What piece of advice you give to each delegation for the next week's meeting?
Well, I think the first piece of advice is to approach the meetings with an attitude that these are opportunities to shape positive outcomes, number one. So bringing in a commitment to, or a spirit of collaborative endeavour, I think would be a useful starting point. That the posture isn't one of parties who exist in a relationship of animosity coming together to somehow hammer things out. So that would be the first thing. The second thing that I think I would try to impress upon them all, and perhaps this is something that is a little bit easier on the China side at the moment, because I think China is actually under substantially less pressure than the United States, but nonetheless, to be calm. Right? This isn't something that needs bluff and blunder. I mean, these are engagements that demand statecraft, and statecraft does mean being able to be open, to conduct dialogue with reason, to be empathetic to the concerns of of others, and ultimately realize that that what happens today obviously affects what happens tomorrow and going forward. But most importantly, in terms of those effects, that the decisions that are being made all the time by these great powers and great nations affect the fortunes of, many mortals on this earth, and that as a result of that, there is a sense of responsibility that comes with that. And if they can approach these meetings with that sense of responsibility, as opposed to merely seeing these meetings as opportunities to display and maybe salve vanity, then something positive could come out of it.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant, Warwick. Thank you so much. Of the many pearls of wisdom you shared with us today, and of course, adding to your extraordinary book as well, as Ali's already noted. Um, the discussion you've given us about the passing on the wheel is so important. And I think what you've told us is that, get away from the determinism of capitalist evolution that you so ably show in the book. And also you point to the fact that the Chinese actually recognize this, that the Chinese are not looking for the next moment of unipolarity, but they recognize that they're living amongst many equals. Whether they'll be first amongst equals or not, I don't think is the point. But the point that you show in the book and what you've told us today is that of all the major powers and great powers that we've had in the cycles of history, of recent history, the Chinese are the one that recognize that absolute hegemony is fool's gold. And if only they can impart their wisdom to the other side, what international relations theorists worry about is this hegemonic struggle that frankly political economy shows it isn't there, will then change the reality of the lives that you've so ably talked about. So I can't thank you enough, Warwick. Ali and I have really enjoyed reading your book. And for those who can't access it, Ali will give a link to the chat about how we can get it. And we can have a whole discussion just on the book itself, because I suspect that the book itself is part of the history of capitalism, is an ongoing project. So thank you so much, Warwick, for everything that you've done for us.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Warwick.
Anu. Thank you, Ali. It's been a pleasure.